Steve, thank you very much indeed for a fascinating insight, I think, into really what underpins what the teacher is, what the teacher does. Usually I'm right off the top with a question, but when David and I watched this, one of the things that intrigued us was the extent to which, particularly when you were talking about some of those practical activities that teachers can do to encourage this learning environment that brings about learning rather than teaching, that many of the ideas, perhaps to teach students, I'll start again, when people go on to teacher training courses, and our context is largely European, some of those ideas of waiting, silence, or putting 50 students into 25 pairs can seem a bit frightening, dare I say radical. And then we kind of get used to them. So I think was trying to kind of get my head around whether your ideas were radical for the mainstream of language teaching, because we're sitting in our little white middle class bubble in Europe, and that is not the reality of ELT around the world. From your experience and the experience of the participants, are we talking about something radical, or are we talking about something that most of us know but sometimes we forget to do?
Right. Thanks, Neil.
Sorry.
No, it's good. It's all good. I mean, I think you have to define what radical means. Radical presumably means outside of the norm, doesn't it? It means stretching, it means pushing the boundaries, and so on. And I do recognize absolutely that all that we promote, whether radical or mainstream in ELT, doesn't work everywhere. I mean, let's take China as an example, because they tried to introduce communicative language teaching in China some years ago, and I was there for a couple of years, so I know it didn't work. It didn't work for cultural reasons, very deep-seated cultural reasons. So I guess that I'm not trying to be radical. What I'm trying to suggest is that these are on a sliding scale. These are ways that we can work. I'm trying to suggest that instead of the teacher, and this is something I've seen everywhere in the world, that the teacher becomes the center of the universe in a classroom. And I'm trying to chip away at that, perhaps, and say, let's rethink it. Now, there are various ways that you can do that. One is by shock and awe. You can say, stop it, don't do that. And that's kind of what I've done today, in a sense, I suppose. Let's not do that anymore. Let's think again. But what I expect is that some people will say, okay, I'm prepared to give this a shot. But on the other hand, I think there are going to be people who say, I might try a little bit of this. And that's what I mean by continuum. So if you like, it's a continuum of radicalness, going from a very tiny change as an experiment, perhaps tomorrow or Monday in class or whatever, going to someone saying, do you know what? I've just seen the light. Does that help to answer you?
I'd like to dig into a bit more in that. I think it was really interesting, because I think while I was watching, I was almost looking at it like it was a binary thing. You were talking the more liberal classroom and the stricter classroom. And my feeling, and again, I'm interested to know if this is the experience of everyone listening, but is that we're a lot further closer to the more liberal classroom these days that you describe. But I suppose what I want is, what are the real core takeaways you'd like people to take out of this? Because there's lots of tips and ideas, but it seemed like silence and space and responsibility were sort of threads running through it. And I just sort of, that's it. What are the core takeaways you'd like people to have?
Well, I think those are the basics, because from those come other things, and that's why I put so much importance on that whole. That's why I suppose that's why I started off by talking about helping and suggesting that helping needs to be reviewed. So the core takeaways really are that you are not the center of the universe, and your students can do more than they think they can, and more than you think they can. If you want to get in a little box.
Yeah, I love that as well. Like, I think one of the things I've been really thinking about over the last year or so is that we as an industry need to maybe interrogate what we mean by terminology. So, for example, the one that jumps out at me all the time is one person saying student-centered, and I have my belief behind student-centered and someone else, and we think we're talking about the same thing, but actually it's opposite. And so you finished with the word facilitate. And I think I know what I mean by facilitate, or what I believe behind facilitate, but I'd be interested to hear a bit more of what you believe by that. Okay. And maybe other people.
Oh, absolutely, other people. I hope everyone hasn't gone to sleep. For me, facilitation is a bit tricky, because on the one hand, it means, in a sense, passing the ball and getting or allowing. I really hesitate to use that word. Allowing students to do stuff, and I don't want to use that word. And yet, it's kind of, in a sense, it's wrapped up with that idea of facilitate. Facilitation means creating the context in which students are able to do stuff. I think that's probably what I want to say.
Yeah.
Can I ask David,
sorry, yes,
what do you mean by the word facilitation?
So yes. I mean the same, in that creating this, I need to facilitate the discussion of learning. I feel a lot of the time my role as a teacher is not to be giving input for the whole lesson, but to be, to an extent, organizing and orchestrating it so that there is time and space for processing and the discussion of learning. I think one of the things I was interested in is you talk a lot about stepping away and giving people, like, almost to the point of awkwardness, like definitely awkwardness in some of the examples, which is great if you have those learners for a long period of time. And my context is, continuous enrollment, roll on, roll off. I've got a week with one student and 9 months with another student in the same class. Wow. So for me, facilitating, I think as a teacher, I need to take a more active part in that facilitation by scaffolding the conversations while also still creating that space and that time and for them to do it.
Right.
I'm just inviting our colleagues who are joining us via chat, if they'd like to share their views of not only what do they understand by facilitation, but I think, coming back to Steve, the point that you were making early on in this discussion about whether you feel that for participants that facilitation is appropriate in your particular context. Because one of the things that I have become aware of is that as I do more and more work with teachers around the world, what might be mainstream, let's use that word, in my teaching context is entirely inappropriate and shouldn't be put forward as a model in their teaching context. So if it's risky that white middle-class men in Europe put forward their ideas, is there an alternative way in which we can encourage teachers to find solutions in their particular context, which is a really much bigger question than I think we were starting out with, Steve. But, facilitation, I think there are very few people who would say that facilitation doesn't work through a CLT context. But if we go to China and the questions over CLT working in China, what alternatives are there to the kind of things we're talking about today, and how to make the best of the learning process in language teaching?
I think one of the problems here is that we think we know what the best is, and I don't think that we necessarily do. I think that the context of an English language learner in China is extremely different from the context of a learner in Argentina, for example, or in Sweden, let's take that as an, or in Holland, let's take those examples. So I don't think we know what the best is. And I think that there's almost a sense of, we're straying here a little bit into areas which I don't, perhaps we probably shouldn't. But there's a sense of guilt that we happen to be white and middle class. And I think that's, you know, I think we need to be very careful about that. I don't think we need to feel guilty. And look, everybody here, the people from all over the world here, at the moment, there are 27 from all over the place. And that's why I think these things are so important, because everybody is able to comment. Everyone can have a voice here. So it isn't about being white and middle class. It's about being a teacher, wherever you happen to be in the world. And if you recognize that the stuff that I've thrown at you today cannot work in Yemen, for example, that's fantastic. That's a learning experience for me too. I will then understand better and perhaps ask you why. Does this make any sense? It's your fault, Neil.
Big question.
Totally.
But I do think, like, so, right, we've got all these different contexts and everything. And I think we agree that regardless of context, it's important to leave space in the class for the learner. Everyone's mentioned it throughout, learners at the center and everything. But I suppose what I'm kind of wondering is, it kind of came up throughout the talk. The biggest thing was the fear of kind of silence, especially for an NQT, you know, coming through. And one of the things I see, and one of the things I'm constantly battling against, is input to the final minute, you know, and this belief in our industry that we have to give value and input to the last minute with no space, because that's bad. Then they're not learning if there's no space. I'm wondering, how can we sort of combat that? Because I think it starts with NQTs who have a fear, and then it grows into just practice. So yeah, I'm wondering how we could maybe combat that.
Yeah, I think that's right. And I suppose that the simple answer is that we have to stick to our guns in our initial training courses. And I do think there's a bit, again, probably we shouldn't move into this either, but there is a bit of the photocopy syndrome going on in initial training courses. And they're getting weaker and weaker. And I say that quite openly. I think they are getting weak. I mean, if you look at CELTA and TESOL now, they're not the animals that they used to be. And so I think, and I also think that conferences such as TEFL and others all over the world, perhaps, should be focusing more on this kind of stuff than on the extraordinary quasi-academic stuff, which they generally do focus. At TEFL less so, but I've seen conferences advertised in all many parts of the world, which are not really for teachers at all. They're pseudo-academic or quasi-academic, and they're designed for researchers in applied linguistics rather than teachers. And what we really, really need is teachers attending teacher development forums and events, which actually inspire them and give them something to go away with. And, you know, I'm on my soapbox, sorry, and I'll get off it in a second. But so often I say to teachers after, for instance, TEFL, so what did you get? And they say, well, I met a lot of good friends. Okay, that's fine. But that's nothing to do with what TEFL is set up for. So we need to find the courage of our convictions and say, people, let's get together and talk about teaching.
Yeah, I think, unfortunately, like, I mean, I was at TEFL there last week or whatever, but
what did you get out of it?
I really met a lot of nice friends, and it was great. But so I was at Equals the week before, and then I at TEFL, and so I've seen. I think it was nice in those two things to see more people talking about discussing learning and not just here's teaching listening or something. I'm seeing more and more at these conferences, I think, about interesting discussions about feedback and learning and clear objectives for lessons. But I think it's a good move. But I do completely agree that a lot of conferences feel like just, you know, here's a study that I'm presenting. I think it actually, the online conferences that are now available, like the future of ELT and everything, are providing this for teachers to some extent because it's more accessible and cheap.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think that we work in a bubble, or everybody who's here, I think, who's teaching will recognize that idea that we work in a bubble. We may have fantastic staff rooms with great teachers, and we can talk to them in the break, but I think that nevertheless we're stuck in a bubble. We have our students and us, and it's very easy, I think, to get stuck in a rut, to sort of to think, well, I did page 32 this way last time, and I'll do it the same way next time. And that's not how it should be. We should be able to be much more communicative within ourselves.
Can I ask then? I mean, it struck me as we're talking that on the one hand, there are those applications of our understanding of how language learning works, which are inevitably tenuous. But, for example, when we talk about wait time, we can back that up because in terms of just the fact that to process with an interlanguage in the interface that, and maybe interface is the wrong word for SLA, but if you want the students to understand something that the teacher has said or something that they've heard, they need to process it, think about it, work it through, stop, maybe use L1, and then respond to it. So there is a good kind of combination of common sense and an evidence base for why silence is so important. So I don't want this question to take us away from this idea of facilitation and the creation of the learning environment. But Steve, as you've set it up as a discussion about how can we make the language classroom almost regardless of its physical context, China, the UK, Iraq, Ukraine. Besides silence, are there any other top tips that you, and David, you as well, would like to share that you feel universally make the language classroom a better space for learners not to be taught, but to learn?
My first reaction to that is to say real world language. If you're looking for something which is universal, and I'm not talking about native speakerism here, I'm talking about real world language, and that means the English of wherever. And I think that is something which is universal. But other than that, I don't know. What do you think?
I mean, for me, I think I'd stick with the real world, but it's real world objective in that from the beginning of the lesson to the end, everyone knows where they're moving. They might achieve it in different ways. They might reach it in different ways, but they know where they're going, and they can immediately see how it extends beyond the classroom. So whether you are in China or wherever, it should be something that is real life for those students. And then in terms of language, yeah, I mean, in my context, it's lots of different nationalities and things, but that's great because you allow the choice of the language. Here's a lot of language that you can use in this situation. You guys choose what's relevant for your context and what is not. Like, ignore phrasal verbs or idioms if that's not relevant for you. It's not going to make you intelligible. So I think that's knowing where you're going and having choice along the way is, for me, key.
Yeah.
I love that silence. I love real world language. Could I add maybe getting away from the ability to know language towards the ability to use language? Absolutely. Because being able to spout some grammar rules about the present perfect simple and the present perfect continuous is really worth very little at all if that can't be operationalized. So for me, I guess it's finding ways to encourage learners to use English, to explore it, to make their mistakes, but to get to a point where it's something they can do stuff with rather than just spout those rules.
Absolutely. I mean, that's something which unfortunately we're still talking about, and we shouldn't be. This should be accepted by now, but we're still talking about. I just want to, there are two questions on the Q&A, which I'd like, although neither of them is directly to do with what we're talking about. The first one, perhaps a little more so. Lila Lashari is asking about a student who I think is a bit introverted in class. And I suppose you could connect the answer to that problem with what I've been talking about, because I'm talking really about giving students confidence in their own abilities. So people who are introverted and disappointed by their study, apparently this person, need to be gently encouraged, need to be supported. They need the space, and they need absolutely not to be pressured into doing anything which they don't really want to do. So it's a long, slow process, and that's about as much as I can say, I think, because the question is rather specific. If I might just indulge myself, Cameron asks, what should I do if the teaching job is not well paid in my area? Hey, join the club is the answer to that. I don't know. I don't know. Find some online work. There isn't an answer to that, because that's simply the way the profession is. We are undervalued, and have always been so, and probably will always be so. Right, there you go. That's my view.
David,
yeah, welcome to the club.
I mean, yeah, welcome to our club.
Yes, yes.
Have you got any specific tips? I mean, you work with large teams of teachers. You have a teacher mid-career. You really rate them, and they're like, I don't know if I can stick in this job because, frankly, I just don't get paid enough. And is there any advice that you could give to someone in that situation, other than you have to make your own decision, that can kind of sweeten the bitter pill?
Jesus,
That is our place to do so.
It's so hard. Like, I'm basically going through this the whole time, all the time. It is a constant discussion in our industry, and it should be. There's no direct advice you can give. Like you said, without saying, I encourage you to get a second job, which is not what we want, because working at our schools should be a career and should be a job. But it's incredibly challenging. I suppose one of the things is that I try and talk to people a lot about is, do you see yourself in the classroom forever, or are there different routes? Because once you start opening up other routes within our industry, then you start opening up other possible revenue streams. And I think for a lot of teachers, they don't know the routes to the routes. So a lot of what I do is try and help people to see, if they come to me and ask these kind of things, to try and help them see it's not as hard as you think to become a ELT writer, or to start speaking at a conference and then maybe lead to more things. That seems like a bridge too far for many people, but actually there's a lot of great conferences that you can just start at online, and that will they're looking for fresh faces and fresh ideas, and you don't have to be Delta qualified and have managed a school or anything like that. You just have to love teaching and have something to say. So it's a tricky one, but I try and help people see other routes.
And I think that kind of just looking around you and, thinking, what have I got, or what could I potentially have in the future that I can offer to my colleagues, the people that I work with, in order to create a kind of a virtuous cycle going up. Because it's really easy to get kind of pulled down by things. But then if you find a way to re-engage with your existing environment, sometimes just changing how you do what you do, or doing a little bit more, which might be, well, let's get for example, I have a friend who works in the Middle East, and she was getting a bit kind of like conferenced out. And so she decided, what I'm going to do is create a reading club and invite some friends to come along. and it's been a huge success.
Yeah.
I think Steve's got a subliminal message here about
Yeah.
get your dog, go for a walk.
Yeah, get out of the house. No, it's so true, isn't it? And like, I think the other thing that I'm really interested in at the moment is how blinkered we are about our skills and how transferable our skills are. Like, we are in a unique position of being, let's say, in our industry, experts in communication and experts in culture and cultures and intercultural communication, which is one of the most highly sought after skills in the world at the moment, in the world of business and in the world of hiring and companies. It is the future, and now because everyone can work remotely, it's even more important. So we don't all have to stay in schools teaching. We are experts in a field, and we can move beyond if we pivot a little bit.
There's a comment that's come in from Gabby, referring back to her Socratic midwifery. What a wonderful term.
Like that.
Where she talks about that facilitation is also about elicitation. And elicitation is something that perhaps is slightly affected by cultures, but nevertheless is something that is available to all teachers. How do you feel about the role of elicitation in bringing about good facilitation? Too many shoulds there.
Well, I was trained by IH Hastings in 1980, and the whole what was then called the IH method was all based on elicitation, and we used to joke about it. You know, what do you think? What do you think? What do you? We used to go down the pub and do that stuff because it was, yeah. So for me, elicitation has always been a central component, but I also think now, after many years of reflection, that elicitation suggests once again that the teacher is the center of the process. And so I suppose that I have tried to reduce it, and again, going back to the presentation, pass the ball to students, so that in fact I actually want them to try to elicit from each other rather than me being the center. And Philip Newman, I feel nice to see you here. You've got your guitar handy. Give us a song, mate. Elicitation versus prompting. Yes, yes, possibly prompting as well. But that also puts me in a position of some authority, some power. And while I don't want to avoid that, I mean, I've got a job to do and I'm paid to do it. And so I do have a responsibility to keep, you know, to guide things, to keep things moving. But I also want to diminish my role as that central figure and get other people to do it. Yeah, yeah, not very clear, is it?
No, I mean, I was the king of elicitation, and then one day I walked into a classroom and I was with a friend of mine, brilliant teacher and a brilliant orchestrator of classrooms and learning. And he said the problem is that at certain levels or in certain subject areas, you can only elicit what's already in there. And, you know, for some of these students, they've come to us for the information or the knowledge because they don't have it yet. So I think elicitation can be overused perhaps at lower levels, but that doesn't mean to say that we remain the de facto center. And his way of dealing with this would that be at the beginning of a lesson, he'd hand out a picture, would go onto each table. There'd be some words around it, and probably the first time he ever did this, he might encourage the students to make the relationship between the picture and the words, but there were always spaces around the edge for the students to add their own words. And this was a really nice way of actually giving learners a bit of vocabulary to help them to get started. But because there was always space for them to add their own words or their own questions, and then they could then share them with other tables, that this was kind of an alternative to that IRF. Teacher says, "What do you call her?" And the student replies, "House." And the teacher says, "Well done." and the teacher's just spoken twice as much as the student has, which is not what we want.
Yeah.
So do you think there's an issue with elicitation at lower levels? And have you got any suggestions, if there is, of how we can deal with this?
David?
As we said before, there's no black and white. I mean, I don't think there is an issue with elicitation at lower levels. But as you say, there's only so much that anyone can do. I think a lot of the time there's a belief, I often get with teachers, that just because they're beginners means they're young or babies or something, when really they are people with opinions. And if we're eliciting that opinion with the language that they are able to use, then we are still eliciting. I think the issue comes solely when the teacher is taking the role of the conduit for all communication within the classroom, whether they are eliciting, whether they are asking questions and repeating questions to other people. But if it all goes through them, then we have a problem. Whereas once we remove that, then there will be some elicitation, but it might come from teacher, it might come from another student, it becomes part of the class. So yeah, I don't know if there's necessarily an issue at lower levels, but I think that's the issue at any level, is the teacher being this sort of ring road of communication.
Yeah, I think that's. I think I definitely agree.
But how do we stop that, though? Is the thing. Like it's an easy trap to fall into, being a teacher. I didn't hear what he said. Don't worry, I'll repeat it to you over here.
I think that we've talked a little bit about increasing student confidence. I think we also need to increase our own confidence.
Yeah.
I think that one of the problems is that let's face it, there's a massive amount of academic snobbery about ELT. When I worked in universities, I was definitely looked down upon by some. And I think that is something within the profession that we need to counter. I think we don't realize our own worth, perhaps, is what I want to say. And so that's integrally linked to this particular area that we're talking about now. We need to have more confidence. We need to convince ourselves that, not necessarily that we know what we're doing, because we probably don't, but at least that we're doing our best to do what we know.
I've also seen, on a practical level, just what happens when a teacher is told that they just so that point you were making about when a student asks a question and the students are really capable of answering that question themselves. I'll see if I can find the link. There's a British Council video about this, but it's basically where the trainer might just say, ask her, and then later on just points to the student when they get used to this, and the student just gives the answer.
Yeah, I think that's the point I made, actually.
Yeah, absolutely.
You pass it to somebody else, so that you don't. And I think that that is also a cultural shift required. And I think I also mentioned that this is okay for young learners too, which many teachers find quite surprising, that you can have 7-year-olds doing this stuff, and you just have to be confident. Okay, it'll be a bit messy. There's no question about that. They're not used to it. It'll be perhaps a little noisier than you would like, but they'll get there. And I think that integrally they begin to understand that there's a benefit to this, even if they can't put that into words.
On the topic of messy, there's a question that's come in from Farhad, where Farhad's concerned about, it's in Q&A, it's the second one. Disturbed by my students, and I've been utilizing various ways but couldn't make it. How can I encourage my students to be silent and concentrate on lessons? I don't know about you, but my immediate response to that is, well, actually, if it's engaged and on track noise, then I would say bring it on and enjoy it.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, I think also, sorry to interrupt, Neil, but I also think that it doesn't have to be focused on what they're necessarily doing. Young learners are human beings. They are able to talk. They're able to make a noise. They can. the important thing is that you have the wherewithal to bring things back together. Now, if I might just offer a rather practical, I've got actually two practical solutions to that idea. First of all, you're letting students do their thing, but there's a certain point when you need to bring them back together. One tip that I give people is to whisper. So you stand quite still at the front of the class and you say, and everyone goes, what? And there's silence. It might take a while. And the other thing that I used to do with very young learners, when I wore a tie back in the day, I used to move my Adam's apple up and down. So I'd stand at the front of the class and I'd move my tie would go up and down like that. Don't say anything, just move your tie up and down. And they go, look at him. Look. And what you're doing is creating a little space into which you can insert something useful. So when there's silence, you say, great, have a seat now. That's all you have to do. No shouting, absolutely no shouting. Worst thing you can do, because they'll shout louder than you.
David?
I mean, for me, it was always, I taught young learners for years in Korea and Spain, and it was always the same. It was, don't match the energy, oppose it completely. And I suppose the thing is, it's really hard because you're saying if people are engaged, let them be, but then there's different meanings of engagement. Like, so they're very engaged in being rambunctious or whatever it is. Great for them, but maybe they're not engaged in anything, in learning or anything. So I think it is try and bring it down. And again, go back to what is the one thing we can do across all lessons in order to sort of make it more effective is make it relevant, make it real life, make it something. Again, I was in Spain given the problem class, I remember, and it was just a bunch of 14-year-old girls who had been in the school for like 10 years and had every teacher and everything. And we just turned it into messaging and, you know, how you message, and the language was all involved. And immediately they were involved once I wrote a message on the board that they then had to reply to. And, you know, I think it is, don't match the energy and make it relevant.
Yeah. I think two points I'd like to make which emerge from what you've just said, David. One is that students may not appear to be directly engaged in what you're doing as the teacher, but they may nevertheless be quite engaged. In fact, they may be using a sort of avoidance technique. I've seen that particularly in young learners, but not only in young learners, that people get involved in some discussion about something completely different. And what they're really doing is kind of processing what's going on, because it's quite tricky. Right. And the other thing that I wanted to say was there's something quite different that I've now forgotten, but it'll come back to me. I hope. Maybe. I'm getting old.
Well, while you're thinking, I mean, again, just to come up with a practical one, is that matching the energy, or rather not matching the energy of got stop now. No. And, you know, it's always my fear. I picked this someone up from Mario Rinvolucri, and he would stand at the front of the class, make sure that the students could all see him, and he would simply do this. Now, he'd teach them what it meant. And much like Steve's Adam Apple, I think it becomes a bit of an anchor. So when Steve did the up and down with the Adam's apple, or Mario did this, it was, okay, right, time to come together. But I would always teach this as when this happens, I'd like you to bring what you're saying to an end. It doesn't mean you have to stop immediately, because that student might be about to say the best thing that I've said in English all week. And you don't want to just say, time out. So, you know, and then you could almost do this. And I've seen teachers do this as well as a kind of whisper.
Yeah.
I hope that gives some ideas for how to kind of, you know, think about whether that noise is in fact as disruptive as actually you think it might be. It might be a positive sign.
It's like controlling teachers at a conference talk. Just seeing everyone in TEFL doing this.
Yeah.
Excellent. We're coming towards the end, I guess. Is there anything that we've not covered, either from our participants and our people joining us, or anything that we wanted to add into the mix?
I did wonder one thing. You were talking about Steve, so students coming in and sitting wherever and giving them that space to sit wherever and to sit with whoever as well. And I think it's important to give freedom of choice. And I love to stand up and find someone you want to speak to and you're comfortable speaking. I use that quite a lot. But I also think there's a certain amount, if we want to create a classroom where we're not the conduit, seating is ridiculously important and can set the tone for the whole thing. And that's where I sometimes wonder if I'm the facilitator of the discussion I want, therefore I have to instruct in certain areas. And I wonder where you draw the line on that.
I absolutely agree. I mean, again, you know, it's the old story which we talked about earlier about the radical continuum, if you like. Mm-hmm. So there are things that I haven't really talked about when a teacher authority is actually needed, and there are times when there's no question about that. This is, you know, ultimately, if necessary, I do have the authority to, I suppose, impose. I'd like not to, but if I have to, I have to. And so, yeah, if I know that, you know, two particular students don't work well together, if I know that they're constantly at each other or something, then I might well decide that they're not going to sit together. That's my prerogative.